So if we take a look at our grading rubric, it's pretty clear cut. If you have any questions about it, please reach out to me. But the first part of the rubric is, do you have a specific developed analysis? Meaning, did you analyze all that I'm asking for? Audience purpose, ethos, pathos, and logos. Supporting detail, equally important. Any kind of supporting information that you provide from the genre is related to the analysis and relevant. So for example, if you say, if you're analyzing a speech and when you're in the ethos paragraph section and you say, the speaker establishes ethos by talking about a former experience that they had in their past when they said, quote, and you make a quote from the speech, and then you afterwards you describe why that's ethos. As long as you constantly, when you make a reference from that genre that you're writing about and analyzing, that you explain why why that represents ethos, why that represents pathos, why that represents logos. Because if you don't, then it falls back a little bit on summary, and you don't want to do that. You want to always, anytime you make a reference in your genre to prove your analysis, remember the word why and explain why, because that makes you audience aware. You're assuming your audience doesn't know what ethos, pathos, and logos are, so you're kind of teaching them. So this is why this is ethos, this is why this is logos. You're making a formed analysis from it. And as long as you maintain focus, and what I mean by that is that's the main reason why section headings are important, because it guides the reader along. You're telling them which part you're moving on to next. So these section headings are a big part of focus. Again, they are not required. If you have a clear topic sentence at the start of each section that explains what the paragraph will be about, that also is an important part of the focus grade. Where I've seen the grade suffer is if a student starts talking about logos and starts analyzing logos, but then they jump to pathos for a little bit, then they jump back to logos, then they go to ethos. If you're all over the place in a paragraph, once you make sure you fully analyze the rhetorical appeal and then move on to the next one. That's a big part of focus. That keeps your analysis organized and you don't quote, jumping back and forth, basically, is what I mean by that. Writing fluency overall, no grammatical errors. Academic voice, and what I mean by that most importantly is the paper written in third person? So make sure you don't use the word I, make sure you don't use the word you, keep the paper as the genre, they, them, it, people, words like that, and just follow that chart that I'm providing for you. Where you can write in first person if you want is in the conclusion, because that way you've analyzed everything. In the conclusion, you can offer your opinion if you'd like to, or you can keep it in third as well. And as long as you're keeping the media design format that I've talked about here, that's all part of the rubric. So that makes it 150 points. I recommend that you keep this PowerPoint up while you're working on your essay so that you can constantly make a reference to it to make sure you're covering everything that I'm asking. Just remember, I'm going to kind of scan through some of this PowerPoint just because it reiterates what I've just talked about in the guidelines. So just, again, make sure it has the following sections, or make sure you're using topic sentences for each paragraph that tells the reader what the paragraph is about. Remember that, and like I said, I have a little bit geared more towards having section headings, but again, you don't have to have section headings for each paragraph if you don't want to. It just helps the reader. Again, the introduction should just be summary. That's the only place you're summarizing. You're telling the audience what the genre is that you chose. Title of the genre, where the audience can find it or access it, who created the genre, just the main summary of it. Overall, assume your audience didn't view, read, or watch the genre. And then end the paragraph with the thesis, meaning what is the purpose of the paper. Mention the rhetorical appeals in that thesis statement because it ties in the rest of the analysis well. Again, for audience, think age, gender, location, interest group, etc. Don't say everyone because that's difficult to say. Not everybody's impacted by your genre. and explain why they're the audience. It gives you more to write about, and it begins your analysis. Why, if you include why in all of this, it's more of an analysis paper, which is what we want. Again, you can combine these or have a separate paragraph. What is the purpose? Why? How can you tell? Maybe provide a sample from the genre to explain. You don't have to worry about in-text citations for this. We are not an APA just yet. Just what I do want, and I'll add that to the guidelines, is provide the link or explain that's why the introduction is so important, so that I know where to find it, so that I can view it too before I read your paper. Ethos paragraph, again, if you don't do section headings, start the paragraph with your own definition of ethos. That's an excellent topic sentence because that tells the audience, oh, okay, this paragraph or paragraphs is going to be only about ethos, which is important. After you define ethos well, the rest of the paragraph is analysis, of course. Whenever you find an example from the genre at media, explain why it's an example of ethos. Does your genre lack ethos? You know, some of the samples we saw in my lecture this week, some of them don't have 100% of each appeal, and that's okay, it happens. So don't skip the information, then write the rest of the paragraph about where you can evaluate, and you can determine whether or not the genre needs more ethos, or why it's fine the way it is. Does it meet the conventions of the genre? Does a poem necessarily have a lot of ethos? It might, but maybe it doesn't need to because it's more of an emotional piece, something like that. You must include the word ethos, pathos, and logos in this essay because it's a rhetorical analysis essay, so we have to find those words in it. And all these paragraphs follow the exact same wording as this ethos paragraph, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But again, if you have questions about the format of this paper or what should go in each section, just let me know. Feel free to visit my virtual office hours for that. I can definitely help you out with that. I always tell students what helps is kind of related to the assignment you're doing this week, the rhetorical appeals chart, the practice that you're doing, is just do that for your paper too. Make a little chart for notes and turn that into your paper. That way you don't have to jump back and forth when you're writing the paper. That might help. It's just if you take a bunch of notes and turn those notes into your analysis paper. Can't end the paper on the analysis, you gotta have a conclusion, so we can evaluate it fully now. We can look at the whole analysis and see if you were persuaded or not, which of the three appeals were used the most, which was used the least, did it persuade you? It's kind of a good way to look back on what you just worked on. And it kind of is neat because the audience can maybe either disagree or agree with you. So helpful hints, make sure you understand what each rhetorical appeal means, of course. Use this PowerPoint. Use the rhetorical appeals of persuasion PowerPoint as well to make sure you're fully aware. Keep the paper in third person so that you don't you're not persuading them. It's not a persuasive paper, it's an analytical paper. So example of third person in the correct way. The genre uses ethos by showing the company name at the end of the advertisement. This is an example of ethos because it's how they use their brand to gain trust. That's you telling the audience why, which is so important because if you didn't have this sentence, it would be more summary, which we don't want. Example of first person, so that's incorrect. I found ethos when I saw it, or you might find ethos in the genre when you see, avoid I and you. Make sure page 1 is your cover page, title page. I don't know why that's cut off. My apologies. I will fix that typo. Again, you don't have to have an APA formatted title page. Starting next week, you will. So we're going to cover APA next week. Use the student samples, as a guide. Always follow my guidelines. Sometimes I make little changes each semester. But, the student samples I think are helpful just so you can kind of have something to compare the paper to. So if y'all have any questions, just let me know.